Everyone. Welcome to a Friday edition and a special season of Abolitionist Lent Bible Study. This Lenten season, we're going to be furthering our practice that we started in Advent and inviting people across traditions and mediums to explore themes of revelation, disruption, examination, and embodiment in ways that will support a larger faith movement, reimagining restorative solutions to community safety, health, and wellness. So abolition means not just the closing of prisons and ending of policing, but also putting in place the vital systems of support that many communities are systematically disenfranchised from. I want to name the Abolitionist Lent is a collaboration between organizations and some individuals, including Fellowship of Reconciliation, More Like Presbyterians, and the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, as well as some additional thought partners, including Reverend Lindsay Anderson, Miles Markham, Minister Candace Simpson, Reverend Ananda Barclay. So you're invited to join us through the Lenten season, which we are launching now, as we define, explore, reflect, and take action to further the inbreaking of abolition into this world. Today, I am excited to be exploring Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 17, the little story of a covenant with Noah, through the theme of promise with one of our Abolitionist Lent and Advent co-conspirators, Reverend Emily Brewer. Emily, it's wonderful to have you on this show today. So before we begin, we want to introduce our name, our pronoun, work, and identities, because we know that we bring our context with us whenever we open the Bible. Emily, welcome.
Thanks. And I just feel like I need to say I'm a longtime listener, first-time caller here, and really thrilled to be here. Anyways, my name is Emily Brewer. For my work, I am the executive director of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and I've been in that role since about 2015. We are a 76-year-old organization committed to nonviolence. And we were founded by and for conscientious objectors during World War II. So very much come from this lineage of anti-war and creative, active nonviolence. And my pronouns are she and her. And apart from my role as with the Peace Fellowship, some of my identities that I carry are that I am a white cisgender woman. I hold a U.S. passport. I was born and raised in the South, but currently live in New York City in Brooklyn. I am a daughter and a sister and newly a mom, which is an identity I'm still figuring out. I guess we're all figuring out most of our identities for most of our lives, but that one feels real fresh. Yeah. I bring a lot of other identities. Many of them just are really kind of normative identities. And so I think also I want to name that I am challenged and shaped, hopefully, by people who don't carry all of those normative identities that I do. And I'm really grateful for all of those people who have helped shape me.
Yes. Thank you, Emily. And I want to name, we are longtime collaborators, first-time Facebook Livers together.
That's true.
We've gotten to conspire on justice and inclusion and abolition newly, but liberation within the Presbyterian Church and for the world for as long as you've been in ED and before that even. So I'm grateful for you and the partnership we get to have with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. So as y'all know, I'm Patchin McNeill. My pronouns are he and him. I get to serve as executive director at More Like Presbyterians, working for full inclusion and abundance for LGBTQIA+ folks and how we live that out in the world. So that's the work I get to do when I'm not on Facebook Live. And my identities are as a white transgender man, also born and raised in the South, as I say all the time. And here I'm living back in North Carolina, which again continues to be a study in, I think, in paying attention to narratives that have shaped this state and continue to shape our political reality. And I think, particularly in the work of abolition, the ways in which legacies of enslavement and genocide, especially as we explore this text, continue to permeate the land we're on, as someone sitting on land that has been occupied by Cherokee and continues to be occupied by Cherokee indigenous people. Yes, identities. I love the idea, the fresh identity of being a parent. I have a sibling going through that exact same thing. So I think it's interesting when those new identities spring into our lives. and though all of the identities we have are always in formation, I think there's something very precious and challenging and amazing about a brand new identity that is coming into your life. So sending you solidarity and all those who are kind of in the midst of navigating whatever your new identities are. So that said, I'm excited to explore this text together. We're going to be reading Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17 together. And again, we're going to borrow from Lectio Divina with a twist and a frame of abolition, but we're also going to explore some themes of promise within this text. So Emily, would you be willing to kick off our first reading as we think about and notice what is going on in this passage that stands out to us?
I'd love to. And this is a Common English version. And I feel like I didn't even really see what Bible I was grabbing because I was trying to sneak into the dark room where the baby is sleeping to grab the Bible. But I just feel like it warrants naming too that this Bible is actually Daniel Berrigan's, and a friend got it and gave it to me as an ordination gift. So when we're talking about some of the dreamers and ancestors that have shaped us, that feels important to name. Okay, so Genesis 9, 8 through 17. Again, God said to Noah and his sons, I am going to make a solemn promise to you and to everyone who will live after you. This includes the birds and the animals that came out of the boat. I promise every living creature that the earth and those living on it will never again be destroyed by a flood. The rainbow that I have put in the sky will be my sign to you and to every living creature on earth. It will remind you that I will keep this promise forever. When I send clouds over the earth and a rainbow appears in the sky, I will remember my promise to you and to all other living creatures. Never again will I let floodwaters destroy all life. When I see the rainbow in the sky, I will always remember the promise that I have made to every living creature. The rainbow will be a sign of that solemn promise.
I'm curious what stood out to you in this first rereading of a very familiar passage.
I think one thing that stood out, and especially as I was reading it aloud, is just the repetition that God is talking about the rainbows being a reminder to God's self of this promise, of this relationship. Of course, the rainbow feels like stands out as something that I connect to childhood. That's what I remember about this story from childhood, so I can't not notice it now. But I think especially just the repetition, like I will remember, I will never destroy again.
Yeah,
leaps out at me right now.
Yeah, I don't think I remembered that level of repetition from, before I reread the passage in prep for today. And what stood out to me was the promise not just to Noah and their descendants, but with every living creature that was there with them in the ark, but also, I don't know, just the breadth of that promise was, I think stood out to me, and thinking about this idea of an arc or a rainbow or some, the bow being an all-encompassing promise.
Yeah, has no discernible beginning or end usually, right?
Yeah. But yeah.
No, I think when you were talking about how the breadth of it, and it's all creatures, right? Not just all people. And it was reminding me of, I was on a call last night and somebody opened us with the poem. I'll look up the name of the author in just a moment, but of A Small Needful Fact, which is a poem about Eric Garner working in the Parks Department, and how connected Eric Garner's life was to those things that give breath to the world, and especially in New York City where I am. But there's a phrase in there talks about all the necessary creatures.
Mm.
And so when I'm reading this text after having read that poem just 18 hours ago, there's like the creatureliness of it is coming out of me, and the necessary creatures.
Yeah, because God is saying something about like all the creatures that are emerging from this ark, those that have been supposedly safely contained within this structure, but the connection between us as creatures and the earthly creatures and the earthlings that we were. And I think Jess actually added a citation for that poem as well, because we have shared it before. It's such a powerful, needful fact, the reminder of the deep connection. Something that kind of messed me up in preparing for this passage. I love a rainbow, as we know. I like to point to my banner behind me at various intervals throughout our conversations. But I was reading a commentary in the recently released PCUSA Connections lectionary situation. And they talked about the word bow, keshet, which has been translated as rainbow, is also a word for an arrow, like a drawn bow. And what they were saying, this is Ryan P. Bonfiglio, yeah, I think I pronounced that correctly, is that this idea that's usually it's a war image, this drawn bow. And what he was naming was that in this idea of a bow in the sky, it's like an undrawn bow, just like loose, hanging, not for the purposes of war. And that this could be an image of demilitarization instead of, and not instead of, but like kind of underlying this idea of like a rainbow, I think also means peace. We have this peace dove that Noah sends out to see if there's dry land. And that completely just flipped my lid a little bit. So I had to bring it in because I've been thinking about it ever since, especially as we're exploring abolition and the connection between anti-war, ending of war, and abolishing systems that cause war internally, and sort of separate people from their families. What if this is truly a promise of demilitarization?
And that's beautiful too, and really fits in with the. I imagine we may talk about this in maybe in one of the other questions, but the flood story. So this is the promise at the end of the flood, and we actually have two flood stories, right, that are kind of woven together, that we think are probably from two different sources that were kind of oral histories passed down. And then when they were written, people were like, well, we have these kind of two stories, and rather than like pick one or try to just do a mashup, we're just going to like kind of keep both stories and interweave them together. But the promise text that we're reading for today is most connected, comes from the same source, we think, as the story that names that the flood is punishment for human violence. And so to have a reminder that like we will not use these weapons of violence any longer, that's really powerful. I love that. And I did not know that.
I know, me either. And the idea that, kind of back to your original comment, that God is almost reminding God's self, I'm not going to do this anymore, which I think is also important connection with our work of abolition around the constant need to, even if we commit to something, if we covenant to something, we have to keep repeating it over and over again. It's not just a one-time action and it's done, but that what are the reminders of our commitments and our values that can be right in front of us so that we're not slipping back into, the use of force or militarization. Josh Sheeran just commented on Facebook around God is hanging up arms against the people to say, I'm putting these weapons down. And the idea that I think Jess Cook shared around, it's like swords into plowshares and bows into rainbows. I think that's a really neat way of seeing that, both interpretations are accurate. and help to extend the metaphor.
Totally. I love that.
Do you want to, I think we're kind of excited to move into our second and third reading. We can spend more time there. So let's do that and kind of be more quick about it this time to move into that. So in the second reading, we're going to think about how does this text call us to resistance? And as I've offered before, we think of resistance in a nuanced way, both resistance to empire and status quo, and where are we resisting parts of this text? What is resistant within us? And moving into an exploration of that can help kind of break up the logjam sometimes and open a new flow from the Spirit for us in this text. So I invite that to surface. I will do I'm happy to do the second reading, and I will read from the New Revised Standard Version so we can have a couple of different interpretations. All right. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, 'This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth.' God said to Noah, 'This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth.'" Where did you hear a call to resistance in this second reading, Emily?
I hear so many, and I think I'm still kind of reeling, turning over that image in my head of this being a bow. But I think when I think about within ourselves, I'll speak kind of in the context of the moment that we're in and this conversation on abolition and Lent. As a white person, I think about this work as anti-racism work and God repeating over and over to God's self, "I will remember, this will remind me, I'm going to need a reminder. This is going to remind me again. Every time I see this, I'm going to remember." But that like this work is not something, it's not an arrival point. Like we never arrive at a point of being perfectly anti-racist. We can read every single book there is, whatever. It's a constant work and tending and noticing when defensiveness comes up, noticing when we're exhibiting some of those white supremacy cultural values around, being super agenda driven rather than relationship driven or whatever that might be. There's several, I'm referencing specifically some work by Tima Okun around white supremacy culture that I think is just really helpful for those of us who are white as individuals and as people in organizations and institutions to notice some of those, because those qualities and characteristics come up over and over again, and we can know all about them, and we still have so much to do constantly to notice, to redirect. And in the context of Lent, I think about repent, right? Where it's a constant need for repentance and a turning, right? Like we're going down this path, whoop, we got to turn and repent and go a little bit different direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not a static arrival point. God too needed reminders of the ways that God wanted to live or be in relationship with the people.
And what I noticed is that this promise is not something disconnected from the act of repentance, that God is saying, here's what I did. and I don't want to do that again. I'm making a covenant with you not to do that again. And I think so much of we have to talk about abolition in the context of reparation, in the context of confession, and moving just to some vision of liberation that doesn't have some really important steps within it. I don't think actually achieves what abolition is meant to do. If we take down and end prisons and policing, okay, but can we acknowledge the harms that those systems have caused for generations? And what are we going to do about that? It made me wonder, what would it be like to write our covenants of abolition? What are we hoping for in the work of abolition? Like never again shall humans be locked into cages, or never again shall families be separated from each other as a form of punishment, right? Like, what is that litany of confession for a promise that we're trying to live out?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think what you were saying makes me realize, that the flood is a punitive measure against humans, right? It's meeting the violence of humans with utter destruction, right? And it's like, and that's what our prison system does. It just utterly destroys people's lives. It destroys communities. It destroys our relationships with each other. Prison and policing, right? The ways, not just the police force, but the ways that we police each other and the ways that the church polices people, right? It destroys relationships, and it's a punitive measure against behavior that we have deemed
right.
Unwanted, right? And in this story, God is like, oh, that doesn't work. Right. That's not what we need to do.
Right.
We need another way. That's
and the covenant
totally
is
new.
all about relationship.
Right. Totally.
That I tried to punish without being in relationship with you. And that doesn't work, as you're saying. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I thought it was really exciting what you were saying. And and what is also resisting, I just want to hold what is also resisting in me is recognizing the context, like you said, of this passage. So we have this beautiful covenant, and then right after this, we have the Canaanite Curse of Ham conversation. So Noah and his family get out of the ark, then they have a family squabble. And that has been, used to justify so much, oppression, mistreatment, division. And I'm holding that. Also, when you were saying, God said, using the flood as punishment, what it made me think of, this may be kind of wild, is, so we're reading Genesis, which is an interpretation of a natural disaster. So a huge flood. We have other sources that have named, ancient Near East sources that said there was a huge flood and it was horrible. And so then we had an opportunity, what did that flood mean? Was that from God? Was that something about our relationship with God? Are we being punished as sinful creatures? And then we have this next story of the quote curse of Ham or whatever, which is also an interpretation of a family dynamic. So noticing part of our work of abolition is reimagining interpretive story. So what is the narrative that we're telling? And I think punitive justice, that's the only story we think we can tell. Someone did something harmful and then they must be punished. So what does it mean for us to kind of scroll back, zoom out, say, wait a minute, there's another way to tell a story of what could be possible from this horrible instance. It's we may not be able to prevent every horrible disaster, every act of violence, but our response to it is just as important in some ways. I don't know. Brewer, what you thinking?
Yeah, I think that really resonates. And I just think I didn't remember if you named this explicitly, but just I think it really warrants naming that the the curse of Ham is often used, especially by white folks in the past, to justify chattel slavery in the United States, right? I mean, and lots of other kinds of divisions. I'm sorry if you said that, but it feels important.
No, I didn't go to
I think like those were my ancestors who did that.
Yeah.
And it's important to me, at least, to acknowledge that it has been used to justify all kinds of divisions and hierarchies in humans, but that one specifically feels important to name in this context of abolition.
Right.
Yeah, and I think I also didn't realize till I reread this text that it's Noah who does the cursing, not God.
Mm-hmm.
I think somehow that had just all gotten mushed up in my head, like often happens when I actually really closely read the text. But yeah, so like God has made this covenant with Noah, and I want a story where Noah changes how Noah lives, right? And yet, like, Noah's person, I'm a person, we mess up again. And he messed up big by cursing a whole nother people, right?
Yeah.
But it's not God, it's Noah who does the cursing. And God keeps God's promise. God never destroys the entire earth again in the Bible.
Right.
And yeah, I think your point about this is a story understanding a natural disaster is important, and also like within the context of the larger Bible, that at least what we have, the texts that we have show us that the interpretation is that God didn't destroy again in that way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, we could a long dive into scriptures, authors, and relationship with God. Anyway, yeah, and I think we're in this moment of pandemic, and I'm just so aware of the hope versus the challenge. And here's this family that just got off an ark, stuck together for as long as they were, and then they have this horrible truth be told, this next story of the conversation and the cursing of the Canaanites, I barely have ever read. And that's probably because I know it's such a horrible text and I just haven't dealt with it. So that's on me. But what is it like to, I think, hold in that opportunity for remembering God's promise at every decision? Like, what, you have this family conflict and drama playing out. There could have been another way to have, like, what would it be like to remember God's promise for all the creatures? Then I'm pretty sure you wouldn't curse a whole nation of people if you could have remembered that. And so I think there's something in this work of resistance, like you were saying very early on, that the commitments that we have to abolition, to liberation, to justice, those can't just be over here, pie in the sky. They actually have to impact how we interact with one another. And that goes to the level of our families, and that goes to the level of our communities. And so if we're espousing a some sort of beautiful liberation and abolition vision, but yet mistreating the people in our immediate circle, that's something to notice.
I think, do you remember that movie about Noah that I think was called Noah from, I don't know, probably 8 or 10 years ago?
I don't think I watched it.
I think I did see it. I remember very little of it, but a friend was reminding me that I think that the interpretation in the movie of this scene is that Noah and his family were kind of chosen to be the ones to survive and to be set apart while everybody else is destroyed. And at the end, that this scene is interpreted as Noah being kind of so traumatized by the flood and by the survival that he gets so drunk as a coping mechanism. But I think when I don't want to get too far down that thread, but I think when I think about it in this context, and if I think about Noah kind of being understood as like set apart, which is often the way that white supremacy operates, right? It's like this idea that for some reason, skin color, white people are seen as over and against people of color, particularly Black people. Everything is measured, right, against Black and white. But that also damages Noah's relationships, right? That kind of, it's destructive to Noah as well.
That's right. I love that reminder again of how much, if again, especially as a white person, if I'm separating justice and abolition and liberation as something I'm working, on behalf of for other people, but not recognizing that is also part of my own liberation and transformation, that I'm not immune to the, what it's been like for Noah to be like, oh, this changes the way I have to behave. And yet, like, also recognizing what you were naming of the trauma and, like the malforming of what kind of a kind of separated and apart experience could have been. I just want to bring in something that Lee Cateau says around thinking about the rainbow, which upon the first glance has a definite beginning and end, but actually rainbows don't have that ending. They're a circle, that it's a continual work of confession, repentance, and the work of justice, which again, I think that's also something we could apply to ourselves, that this is our covenant within ourselves of this work, is that it is going to be on a continual cycle. And often it's premised upon messing up, repenting, and turning around, redoing, and repairing.
Totally. I think I just want to name too that I'm recognizing in the context of this conversation and reading this story, like we often do, that I am like identifying both with Noah in ways that I think are potentially challenging to me as a white person, hopefully, and leading to self-examination. I also was identifying with God early on, of like needing reminders, but just noting how much kind of we read ourselves into the text.
Which makes me wonder, what does it look like to identify with the animals
and
the creatures?
Yeah, and all the folks who were killed, right?
I think this pandemic and our ongoing reckoning of racial injustice is such a reminder of those who have been killed in the wake of these systems that were set up to destroy, and they achieved their purpose. No, the COVID was not. Again, it was a natural disaster, but the structural response heightened. It's like, opening the levees, for example, and knowing that particularly marginalized folks were going to receive the brunt of the virus, as if, like, if there was some sort of background quest for herd immunity, who would be killed to achieve that end. If we're trying to avoid a major flood in a city, whose houses are we willing to destroy to achieve that end?
Right. Yeah, because the story is seen as sad, and it's a story of devastation, but like we never talk about what all was lost, or would have been lost in that flood, right? It's kind of like, oh, that's a bummer. Okay, well, and then chapter 10, let's go on. But yeah, all of the stories that didn't survive.
Right. Yeah, this is truly a story of genocide. Potentially Earth being devastated. I think certainly the immediate area of where these folks was completely destroyed, and the loss of that. And it makes me think, like, we can't necessarily prevent a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina, if that was going to the name I referenced from the levees. But again, there were human decisions that impacted the way, first of all, the impact of the environment leading up, that allows for super hurricanes. It allows for our Earth to manifest weather in this way because of climate change. And then all the decisions of, as you're facing this storm, where to put the FEMA site, which levees to open. We that's been studied, a lot now in terms of the misresponse, and I'm sure this past year will be as well. And as abolitionists, I think a part of our role is to notice the different decision points that, again, lead to furthering the disaster.
And the violence, right? Like those injustices that make Hurricane Katrina, COVID, all of these things hit some communities first and worst. That unequal impact of these like natural disasters is a result of the like very unnatural violences that we have set up structurally, which I think is what you were saying. But just like when I think back about this text, the flood came as a result of human violence, right? And the devastation was punishment for human violence. And I think that we're trying to get out of a reading of this as a punitive thing, but I think it warrants noting that the violence brings about destruction and it impacts some communities much worse than others.
Right. And I think it is an act of resistance to notice and name that. And we might be, I think sometimes you just want to read the beautiful text about the rainbow.
Yeah, let's just read the rainbow.
Let's just read the rainbow. Let's reading rainbow. Which makes me think it's time for our third reading, speaking of, to move into what vision for the work of abolition this text offers. I think we've already been naming that, but a further question that I've been sitting with as part of this third reading is, what are we invited to abolish as part of this passage? So I want to hold those two questions for us and invite you to read us for the third time.
Thanks. And we are 8 through 17, right? Genesis 9, 8 through 17. Again, God said to Noah and his sons, I am going to make a solemn promise to you and to everyone who will live after you. This includes the birds and the animals that came out of the boat. I promise every living creature that the earth and those living on it will never again be destroyed by a flood. The rainbow that I have put in the sky will be my sign to you and to every living creature on earth. It will remind you that I will keep this promise forever. When I send clouds over the earth and a rainbow appears in the sky, I will remember my promise to you and to all other living creatures. Never again will I let floodwaters destroy all life. When I see the rainbow in the sky, I will always remember the promise that I have made to every living creature. The rainbow will be the sign of that solemn promise.
Vision for abolition.
I think where I'm landing right now is in coming out of talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, the increasing just devastation of the economic inequality that, the stock market is going real great. So the rich are getting real rich, and, other people are unemployed and not receiving any payment. People are being evicted, all of these kind of compounding things. And on top of that, the pandemic of police brutality that we've been living with for 400 years and more, and all the violences that are connected with that, I'm like, where is the promise? Right? Like, when you ask about like, what is the vision for abolition? I'm like, what? I want to know where the promise is. Like, where is the rainbow? And it's not just a vaccine. Like, that is a sign of hope, but it's not a vision of, this will never happen again. I promise that this will never happen again. And so I'm just noting that I'm struggling a little bit because I want to see that promise written down.
Right.
And that leads me to I think part of the vision of abolition is that it is step by step. And we have to think about what the promise is. And the promise is that we can live together with accountability instead of punitive justice as our measure for when we mess up. Because the promise is not that we will never mess up again. The promise is not that we won't need to be held accountable, but that violence and destruction will not be the answer. And yeah, and so I think, police were made to be a punitive measure, particularly against Black enslaved people.
Right.
And so in order to live in that kind of new way, apart from punitive justice, we have to abolish the police, but we also have to abolish the desire to police one another and to build hierarchies. And it's hard to imagine because I feel like my brain, at least, has been so conditioned to think that the way that things are is just the natural way of things. But the promise is that there's something really radically different, and we have to go step by step. We may not know all the steps to get there. We may not know exactly what it will look like, but we know that there is something different that awaits us and that God wants something different for us.
That makes me think about the visibility of that promise within this text, that God is setting something visible, like the bow in the sky, whether it's an arrow or a rainbow. You can see it. And as you were asking, where is the promise? I was reminded of a story that you actually shared with this Abolitionist Lent planning group about the church that chose not to do any actors. I'd love to share some of that story, but being the visible sign of the promise is in looking to communities that are in the process of reimagining safety. I think there's a lot of groups specifically for Black trans women who I think are envisioning new worlds of safety and wellness and caretaking, to help someone through from employment to housing to food to creative vision, that it's not just about surviving but thriving. And I think those models exist, and our ways of whiteness have so prioritized specific metric of what it means to be successful, what it means to like a successful quote program, as if it was some sort of off the side thing. And especially those of us in nonprofits, we know that to receive funding, to receive like anything for our work, we have to prove that it could work a lot of times. But I think there are communities that are proving that a new vision is possible in lots of creative ways. And to me, that's where I want to start envisioning the steps of the promise.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I think part of what I'm hearing you say in that too is that it's not some external thing that's going to come and like bring abolition, right? Like, I think sometimes we expect like the government is going to enact policies, and I think that is a piece of it. But we have to but the policies are shaped by the vision, right? We push for policies that align better with the vision of abolition, and that it's hyper local work. And which I think that, we know that, I think we know that peacemaking happens on a hyper local scale. And it's in, like we were saying, like how we interact with our neighbors, and the idea that hopefully that ripples out, right? That has an impact, and the daily things that we do have an impact. And if lots of us are doing them, that can create transformation. That's not to say we don't also have to do large scale changes, right. But it's kind of yes and.
Right. I mean, because it does start locally, because that's the level of relationship where I was thinking about the Protect the Block actions in Minneapolis, and people whose, like, we're not allowing policing here or trying not to allow the militarized zone. So but yeah, we want to keep our houses, like our community safe from the violence, the outside actors who are coming in to stir up violence. So how do we keep each other safe? It's, it does take knowing who's in your neighborhood and what they need, and making sure they have enough food so they don't have to leave the neighborhood if it's unsafe. And
right, and that part of safety is having housing and oh, sorry, go ahead. No, just I think sometimes like part of what makes people safe is having a house and having food to eat, and being able to walk down the street, and it's not, I think it is like scale upable, but we don't have to start kind of with we got to change everything all at once overnight, right? I think what you were referencing with the church in Colombia, South America, the Presbyterian Church of Colombia, that has taken a strong stand against all the violence, all armed actors of all kinds, and they have been really courageous for years in standing up against that violence, and have reached out to partners in the US and other folks to say, hey, we need you to do this to help make us safe, right? And it's very relational. And now that Colombia is in a process of peace accords, our partners there say, but peace signed is not peace realized, right? Like we have the peace, we had the policies on paper, and now it's up to us to help implement the policies, but also it's up to us to help actually build peace in our neighborhoods and communities. And one of my favorite folks there, named Herman Zarate, he says, like Colombia has been at war for 60 years. It's going to take us at least 60 years to build the kind of society that we want to, that is truly peaceful. And it's not just the absence of war, but like thriving and justice, right? And he's like, this work is going to outlast me, but I'm going to do everything I can in my life to help set this up and to help make this real. And I think that's what we're talking about. Like, we may not see it in our lifetimes, right? And I think the other piece of that feels important to name in this abolition vision conversation, and that you have been naming, of like these communities that are already doing this, already practicing mutual aid, already figuring out how to keep each other safe, is I'm reminded of Dr. King writes about this in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, but that we as Christians, and particularly those of us who preach, have to be really specific. We can't just preach about justice. We have to preach about specifically what it looks like. And because when we just say, oh, justice, we're all like, oh yeah, I love justice. But when we're like, no, but justice means that we are moving funding away from police and into housing for people, or away from police and into mental health care. When we get down to like that more kind of granular level of what justice actually means, is where the rubber hits the road. And that's really where we should be. And I think sometimes this is a very white cultural value, but we're very conflict avoidant. So we just stay in the like, justice is lovely kind of realm. Right. The rainbow. But like, we have to talk about specifically what it means and looks like. And have to move toward the conflict. Like, right, conflict can be really generative.
That's right. Yeah, going back to the vision of the bow in the sky, it has to be tangible, visible, experiential, and embodied, and specific. I think what I'm hearing you say, and really appreciate that. Sometimes in the work that we do at More Light, when we're talking to churches that want to be more inclusive, sometimes they want to keep it at the realm of, let's make a statement and put it in our bulletin, maybe. But I always encourage them, okay, what does welcome feel like? What is it? And if you can't, then it's not realized. And that goes to the level of your bathroom policies. That goes to the level of, are you actually naming identities that you want to include? Are you afraid to say the words gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, and plus? So getting hyper specific, hyper local, with the belief that this can be realized in a structural, scalable way. But if we're always waiting for that before we start to act in our communities, that it'll never come, that we do have a responsibility. I really resonated with the word, this is my solemn promise. And I'm not someone who I would consider myself solemn, but to take something seriously at that level, to say, I'm taking this so seriously that I'm promising it. I'm promising this level of relationship and specificity would be, I think, a one first step.
Yeah, and that's a covenant, right? It's like you can't break it.
Right. Yeah. And that what would it look like to start this Lenten season, which begins next Sunday? We're kind of reading ahead for those who are going to be preparing to preach on these texts. But what would it look like to start our Lenten season? Usually we talk about what we're going to give up. That's one of our practices of remembering our covenant. But maybe our Lenten discipline is, what do we want to covenant to? What do we want to promise that we'll work for? We just ended a 6-month coaching session over in collaboration with Next Church around practices of anti-racism for faithful leaders. And we ended our last session yesterday with, what do you want to covenant to? What are you promising to do? What do you need to give up or willing to risk for the sake of this work? And to me, that feels like an important question for us as we move through these next 40 days, because Jesus gave up, God gave up and risked so much for the sake of abundance and love and a promise of a new vision for what all earth could be.
Mm-hmm. When hearing you say that makes me think that this promise story that we're reading in Genesis and the promise of baptism, that's the gospel reading, are both about thriving life, right? They're promises to thriving, not just surviving, but to flourishing life, I think. And so, yeah, I think I'm gonna hang on to that of like, what do I need? What's a practice that I can adopt in Lent that leads toward thriving and in myself and in my community.
Right. And Jess offered a reframe for us in the chat of, for at the level of congregations, what does it look like if we started the conversations not about who we will lose if we take certain risks, or what might be hard, but instead asked who we might become, who we might meet, and who will join us. And I think that's, to me, another example of a thriving life. What if we thrived? What if our communities thrived? What if not just the sanctuary and our budget and our endowment, but what if our neighborhood thrived? What if our state thrived because of this action that we took? Because I've seen it happen where people of faith take stands against injustice for trans folks, injustice for the carceral state. Like, when we do that, there is possibilities for thriving, and that's an important focus that we can hold.
And I think too, when just to add to, I think so often, I know this is not what Jess was meaning, or I assume it's not, but I think so often in the church, we think about who's going to join what we're doing. And when I think about thriving, it also makes me think like, where can we look for what's already happening, what's already thriving in our communities, and how can we as the church come and support that? Without the expectation that all those people are going to show up at Zoom or in the sanctuary on Sunday morning. But yeah, how can we contribute to what thriving is already happening?
Absolutely. I'm reminded of when so many churches decided to start childcare services for people, especially to empower women to work outside the home and to offer those services affordably and equitably. I mean, not always, but I think many churches made that commitment. And I think that went to the level of the tangible, of the practical, that like, just add another example of, like, if you are starting something, thinking about it from all those dimensions and how important it is to, like, what does it mean to give your money, your time, your talents alongside a service or a vision that's already working. That's evangelism to me, not just who's going to come to our building, but how can we bring God's mission further into the world with those who are already doing it. Yeah. Emily, thank you for this rich reading. We want to end our practice with what's something that we want to take with us or hold in ourselves as a result of this conversation.
Well, I'm definitely holding on to that image of the bow being not just a rainbow, but a bow that God is setting aside as a sign of, no longer putting aside militarism and destruction. That's really hopeful to me. And I think I'm also going to hold on to that, like, this is a sign, a tangible sign for me to remember, for you to remember, for me to remember. I'm going to remind myself, I'm going to remember this. You're going to remember this. But just that like repetition of like, we do this over and over and over again. We need reminders. We reset, we repent, we try again.
Yeah. I think related to that, I'm reminded, I'm taking that reminder of the cyclical nature of the rainbow, that it is a circle, that we're in a circle, that we're in a cycle with all of this, and that there is promise everywhere, even when I see destruction, and to look for it, because there are places where it's visible, rather than just pine for it in the sky, that it is there and I can find it if I'm willing to look. Y'all, thank you for this really rich conversation through the chat. And Emily, as always, I so value your depth of insight, particularly in the communities that PPF has been alongside for so many years, and the wisdom that you've gleaned from those relationships, I think has so much to teach us about what peace really looks like, that it is ultimately an active relationship. So thank you for that.
Totally. And thank you. It's great to be in community of various kinds with you.
Absolutely. All right, y'all, we will be back next week on Tuesday for another conversation about furthering this work of abolition. All right, take care.